Welcome back to Drafting the Past, a podcast where we talk about the craft of writing history. I'm Kate Carpenter, and I just want to say that if you're anything like me right now, you might be finding yourself feeling a little like writing or talking about craft feels maybe significant in light of everything else happening in the world. I really get that. But I'm going to suggest that everything that's happening makes it all the more important to get together and talk about how we tell our stories, how we share our humanity, and how we add our voices to the world. One of my favorite writing quotes is attributed to playwright Edward Albee. The act of writing is an act of optimism. You would not take the trouble to do it if you felt that it did not matter. We're here to remind each other to keep taking the trouble. For this episode, I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast by Dr. Emily Herring.
Thank you so much for having me.
As you'll hear, I've been following Emily's career for a while now, and I was eager to ask about her first book and her shift from academia to full-time writing. Her book is called Herald of a Restless World, How Henri Bergson Brought Philosophy to the People. Sorry about my terrible French accent. It's an intellectual biography of philosopher Henri Bergson, who achieved remarkable fame in the early 1900s, and it's a genuinely fascinating and pleasurable read. Let's dig into it. Here's my interview with Dr. Emily Herring.
When I was a lot younger, when I was a child, I always liked to write, but I did sort of pastiches or write out plagiarism, really, of all the books I was reading at the time. So like the Lemony Snicket books and that kind of thing. But I grew up in Paris, and in France, in high school in particular, and university, there are some very sort of strict and particular rules about essay writing. And you do a lot of it, and you study the methodology, and so a lot to do with structure and how you formulate the problem. And I think that had a huge impact on me. And, you know, in France, everyone studies philosophy in high school, and we would have these 4-hour exams where we would spend 4 hours answering one question, you know. And I feel like that definitely must have had an impact on how I approach structuring my writing and how I think about writing. And then later I moved to the UK to do my PhD. And that, again, is another kind of writing, academic writing. So I was introduced to that, and also to a more relaxed, I guess, way of structuring my thinking than the French way, which was quite nice. And then more recently, in the past sort of 5 years, I've left academia, and I have had the pleasure of approaching writing again completely differently in a more creative way, writing for a general audience. So my biography of the French philosopher Henri Bergson, and that was a real pleasurable experience, and it sort of at once applying all the rules and things that I'd learned over, you know, but also just completely breaking with all those rules and being able to be more creative and use everything I'd learned, but also do what I wanted to do.
Well, I'll start here with just my practical questions for you. So when and where do you like to do your writing?
So I tend to write at home for a very practical reason, which is that for the research for the book I was writing and for the research, I needed to have a lot of primary sources with me, and that it would have, if I wasn't writing at home, it would have involved lugging around lots of heavy books. But if I could choose to, or if I somehow had digitized all those sources, I might have chosen to write in a cafe or something like that. And I find that I tend to find myself writing later and later. The further I advance in a project, the later in the day I tend to start, and then towards a looming deadline, I tend to be working through the night. And I find that at night is when my mind is the clearest. I don't know if that has to do with sort of short attention span things, where actually at night there aren't many distractions, and so therefore that's when I'm most able to think and concentrate. Something relaxing about that for me. But then obviously then I'm sort of jet lagging myself. It's not ideal.
Are there how do you like to organize yourself? Are there tools that you use?
Yeah, so I'm quite chaotic, I think, in general. So I try to be as organized as possible to compensate, I guess. I use Scrivener for this book, and that was really helpful because of the way I sometimes feel like I need a blank page to be able to think. And the nice thing about Scrivener is you can sort of organize lots of different files and things. So I could hide something away if it was getting too overwhelming, and just start fresh with a new page kind of thing, whilst having everything there. And then sources and things like that. Again, I have a tendency for chaos. So I used to just have piles of notebooks, and then I would take lots of notes, but then forget where I'd written things down. So now I have a tablet where I can write and then organize all my notes, because I do like writing by hand when I'm taking notes. I find that I need to do that. So that's one helpful thing that I sort of started doing while I was writing the book. And I also take notes sort of in Word documents, and then so I'll take very extensive notes, and then I'll try to create these master files by theme. So for writing the book, it would be something like, very important biographical information. So I would compile all of the things that I'd found from various sources, and then things about Bergson's personality, that kind of thing. So it seems a bit insane, but it's just the way I mitigate the otherwise just complete chaos that would be my life.
Where in that research process then do you like to start writing?
Again, so both in my sort of when I was doing still in academia PhD research, and then for this, I've not found the right way of doing this. And I found that I was doing research until the very end, which I'm sure isn't ideal, but that's just the way I just kept raising new questions and then finding new things, which meant that then I was having to return to parts that I'd already written. So yes, I wouldn't advise doing this, but that's how it worked for me. So it took me about 2.5 years to write the book, and I would say a solid, maybe there was at least 6 or 7 months which were only research. And then I think I must have started writing. But I think it's important to start writing even if you don't feel like you've completed the research portion, because you never really complete the research portion. And even towards the end of writing the book, I felt like I could have easily spent 5 years, or 10 years working on this project. So you just have to start at some point, otherwise you never will.
Absolutely. What is your approach to revision then? How do you tackle that process?
I think I tend to be a bit hard on myself. I tend to, and I say this because I'm just having flashbacks of going back to drafts and thinking, oh no, this isn't working, this isn't right at all, and sort of really spending a lot of time torturing myself over the choice of a certain word or another. And again, chaotic, but I tend to write and revise at the same time. So I'll be writing something new, and then in the same sort of writing session, I'll be going back to something I've already written and revising. So the revisions seem to be happening constantly. It was my first book, and I think that perhaps because I hadn't had the experience of having, professional editors working for me, I didn't quite realize how helpful they were going to be later in the process. And so I had the idea that I had to produce something that was completely ready, which I later realized, well, no, actually there are editors there to help me. So I might have, it might have been next time is what I'm trying to say. Maybe I'll manage to not be so hard on myself, but there's no guarantee.
Well, without sounding too alarmingly creepy, I have been following your career for several years as you have sold this book and left academia to focus on freelance writing. Can you tell me a little bit about your decision to make that career shift?
Yeah, absolutely. So I finished my PhD in 2019, and then I was immediately hired for a postdoc, which was great, except that I was I hadn't recovered from the PhD process. It would have been nice to have a bit of a break, I think. But obviously I was extremely sort of fortunate to land anything. And because I'm sure some of your listeners, or many of them, are aware that the academic job market is quite horrendous and very competitive, and sort of early career academics spend so much of their time writing up proposals and job applications and funding applications and things like that. It's really difficult. But so I started the postdoc not having sort of recovered from the PhD, nor properly taken the time to celebrate the fact that I'd completed a PhD, because I think that's something as well in academia that we're not very good at celebrating achievements. You know, we do these huge things and then we jump on to the next thing. And it coincided also with the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And so I just started a job in Belgium, in a town where I didn't know anyone, living alone in a small flat. And then suddenly it was sort of lockdowns were looming and that kind of thing. And so I moved back to France, and I had the experience of suddenly being surrounded by people who weren't in academia at all, and who were kind of asking me questions like, but what do you really want to do? Do you really want to be doing this? Or what is it that you like about academia? Because they could tell I was very tired, very stressed. And so I started thinking about that, and sort of progressively started realizing that a lot of the things that I liked about academia, I could still pursue outside of academia, whilst, you know, getting rid of the things I didn't like, were the sort of intense pressures of it and the competitiveness, and also the fact that I was by then I was sort of nearing my 30s at that point, and, you know, not having a stable place to live, not owning your own furniture, the prospect of successive short-term contracts potentially all over the world if you're lucky, because if you're not unlucky, then, you know, just no job and no financial security kind of thing. So all of those things kind of made me reevaluate, like a lot of people did, I think, during the pandemic, made me reevaluate why I was doing what I was doing, what I actually wanted to do. And I actually secured the book deal for my book while I was having all of these thoughts, and so that kind of pushed me in that direction as well. And so I was then thinking, okay, well, what can I actually do that will secure me a form of income? Because obviously a book advance is one thing, but that's not a regular form of income. And so I looked into freelance writing and editing, and found that through the sort of network of contacts that I had managed to build during my time in academia, there were a lot of people who were interested in working with me. So I've been doing a lot of things like helping people for who English isn't their first language and they need someone to look at an article. So that would be one form of editing I'll do. But I've also had some what we would call developmental editing jobs, where people either have a book deal or are self-publishing a book, and they want my input not only on the content, so sometimes it will be things about philosophy or things like that, but they also want me to help them organize their thoughts. And so that's been very stimulating. That kind of work is really fun. So I've managed to find myself some work doing that, and I've been really enjoying it. And although working freelance is by no means, you know, a very stable career move, it still feels more secure and more stable than jumping from postdoc to postdoc felt. Yeah, that was quite a long answer, but
no, it makes sense. At least you get to stay in one place.
Yeah, exactly.
How has your work as an editor affected your writing? Do you find that it shapes your own approach?
Yeah, I would say that I was talking earlier about being quite hard on myself, and I think I'd never be that hard on a client who hires me to edit for them. And so that in turn has perhaps helped me look at my own writing with a less harsh view, because no one is going to produce a perfect first draft. And actually that's, you know, part of the process, and that's what drafts are for. And it's also shown me how valuable having a second pair or third pair of eyes on a project is, because I've been, you know, working on all sorts of projects that people have sent me, and most of the time they're really fascinating, really interesting. But, you know, people get stuck because they've been working on something for so long, and no one can really escape that. So it's kind of pushed me to perhaps show my own work more to other people as well, or to not be as afraid of that. And then just sort of, I guess it's a bit of an almost cyclical thing of the distance that you have to take on your own work. You then apply that to the vision of the other people's work, and then in turn that can inform how you look at your own work. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just something to do with taking a step back from the page, be it your own writing or someone else's writing, is such an important part of the writing process. So editing definitely helps with that, I would say. And then I guess it's also just a matter of helping, as an editor, helping people say what they want to say as clearly as possible, then makes me very aware of what I'm trying to say when I'm writing my own stuff, and is it coming across as clearly as possible. And then being able to put yourself in the shoes of, read your own work as a reader and not as a writer, which is really difficult to do, but try and put yourself in the position of someone who hasn't been spending years working on a subject.
Absolutely.
So I have my
which is
editor
challenging.
glasses on. Yeah, it's very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I hope you can talk a little bit about the process of selling this book. First in finding, writing a proposal and finding an agent, and then selling it to a press. I'm especially wondering, it seems to me that maybe the idea of selling a biography of a philosopher for a general audience is maybe not like an obvious slam dunk for a press. So I'm wondering how you approach that.
Yeah. So I was very lucky in many ways. I think the thing that set this whole process in motion was that initially I was approached by an editor at Aeon to write an essay about my research on Bergson, which I did. And it was about Bergson's female audience, and how that kind of impacted him and how it was used against him. And so it was, I guess, quite a colourful, evocative piece that then ended up kind of on the radar of both an agent and then later my publisher. And so I was contacted by my agent while I was still finishing my PhD. And so at that point, she just asked me, have you ever considered sort of writing something for a more general audience? And at that point, I was finishing my thesis. So I said, no, I've not. I do not have time to think about anything else than my thesis. But then, as I said later on, when I finally had some time to think, I contacted her again, and she helped me put together the book proposal. And I actually used that Aeon article as a sort of sample chapter, because for nonfiction, you don't have to have the whole book already written. Whereas for a novel, for fiction, I think people tend to have something like a draft, a finished product. But so I did have to spend quite a lot of time thinking the whole structure of what the book would be. And that was really challenging because obviously it was very, very early days. So it felt like, and I mean, I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I'm sure it's very, very far off from what the final structure ended up looking like. So I guess it didn't matter too much. It was just a matter of giving an idea of what the contents of the book would be and what the raw matter of it was. But that took me quite a long time to put together, and she helped me with that. And then most of the publishers she then sent that to just said, no, we don't really see there being a market for this. Or, well, from experience, we know that even, some really good recent philosophy biographies haven't done that well. So she got turned down by nearly everyone, but Basic Books, who are my publisher, were very interested. And I guess it makes sense because they're kind of in between academic and general audience publishing. So it was a very, I think, really good, nice fit. And she did actually, my agent managed to get one other press sort of vaguely interested. So that was a really exciting moment, actually. But Basic Books were the ones who were really, really invested in. They made a strong case and they were really interested. But so, yeah, I guess it was a hard sell. And I would never, I'm not even sure it would have occurred to me to do this if I hadn't been approached by someone, because perhaps the task would have been too daunting, to how do I even go about selling this idea? So it was a huge help. I mean, it was indispensable sort of having an agent walk me through it and help me. But so far the response has been really, now that the book is actually out, the response has been really wonderful. And there's been quite a lot of press around it. And that both has to do with the fact that, I have publicists who are helping with that. But also I think there seems to just be, there was kind of a gap in the literature, in the general audience literature. People wanted to learn more about Bergson and his life. So it's been very exciting. But as I said, I think I was very lucky. And if anyone has if there's any sort of academic-y people who have a general audience book idea, my advice would be to start by writing something like an Aeon article, not only because the editors at Aeon, for instance, are really good at they're very serious about how they, about the editing they do and about getting the tone right and the fact checking. So at the end product you'll have there will be something very close to what you would then end up doing, I think, for a book. And it not only would put you on the radar probably of the right people who are looking to publish that kind of thing, but also it's a good exercise in seeing whether there is a book there. And as I mentioned, it can then serve as a kind of sample chapter as well.
I asked Emily to read an excerpt from the introduction to her book to give us a sense of how she approached the writing project. Here's Dr. Emily Herring reading from the introduction to Herald of a Restless World.
At first glance, nothing about Bergson screamed avant-garde. At the peak of his fame, he was a peculiar little man in his 50s. It seemed that at any moment, his frail body might be crushed under the weight of his massive forehead, which he usually covered in a high-crowned bowler hat. His light blue, highly expressive eyes, overhung by thick, dark brows, gave him a perpetual air of mild astonishment. He spoke softly and moved slowly, with the calculated agility of a large insect or small bird. Although his lectures entranced the most fashionable crowds of the early 20th century, he was, at heart, a deeply private, almost timid person. Acclaim and flattery left him uncomfortable, and he found the whole situation embarrassing and inconvenient. On one occasion, Bergson entered the lecture theatre to find his desk entirely covered in flowers. Mortified, he cried, "But I am not a ballerina!" He found celebrity stupid because it distracted both his followers and him from what mattered the most, his philosophy. Fame, he said, had rapidly become odious to him. Whenever he could, Bergson sought refuge from the madness of the city and the obligations that came with international celebrity in the sanctuaries he had created for himself and his family. He spent his summers in the country home built for him in the cool air of the Swiss mountains. The rest of the year, whenever he could, he enjoyed the quiet of his Parisian home, which sat at the end of a garden in a private residence called the Villa Montmorency. When he looked up from his papers, he could see the neighbours' cats playing amid the trees and flowers, and he could pretend he'd left the city. "What I dislike about Paris," he told his friend Jacques Chevalier, "is the lack of sunshine, the lack of air, the lack of silence. People talk about progress, but every new advance is accompanied by the invention of a new kind of noise, trains, cars, aeroplanes. I would have loved to live in the countryside." He envied the peaceful existence of forest rangers who lived among the trees, breathing in pure air away from the commotion of the city, and enjoying levels of freedom he could no longer hope for. It seemed to Bergson that each stage of his career had pulled him further away from a life that better suited his temperament. Yet he also knew that step by step it was a life he had chosen. When he had been assigned his first teaching positions in the smaller and quieter cities of Angers and Clermont-Ferrand, he had grown restless. Although he valued quiet, he had eventually decided to move back to the turbulence of Paris. The gravitational pull of a prestigious academic career in the capital had been too strong. And while he preferred private, meaningful conversations to what he viewed as the empty chatter of social gatherings, he was adept at networking, playing the career game, masterfully making friends with the right people, and seeking out their support at the right time. His Collège de France position and various académie elections came as the result of relentless campaigning on his part. The quiet Bergson always had to make concessions to the ambitious Bergson. Later, one of his main regrets was that he had not taken better care of himself, that he had not followed the advice he so often gave to his friends to take time off and rest.
Talk to me about what went into writing this passage.
It's interesting that you chose this passage because I spent a lot of time. I remember spending a really long time on this particular passage because it was really important for me to capture. So it's very early in the book, as you said, it's in the introduction, and to give a sense of Bergson's physique, his character, and this kind of really central contradiction that inhabits, that he lives and that he lives and breathes, this kind of really difficult tension between the ambitious side of him and then the side of him that would just like to live as a hermit, basically. And yeah, I really wanted to convey all this and give the reader a sense of this internal conflict, because it is what is going to carry the whole story of his life, really. And yes, the humility, but also the deep ambition, and the urge to be perhaps not as famous as he ended up being, but respected, I guess. And so, yeah, I found it essential to give a reader a strong sense of all of that. And I remember struggling because I guess it's a difficult thing to do, to write a portrait of someone in only a few paragraphs. But it was I remember just thinking that the reader needs to get who this guy is early on, and then I have the time to slowly unravel everything throughout the book. Yeah, I'm actually interested in why you chose this passage, if I can ask you.
Sure. Well, it's interesting you say that, because as you were for listeners, I sent this passage to you a while ago because we had to reschedule. And I was struck anew as you were reading it, how much you were doing. So what feels to the reader effortlessly in this section, although I am certain that it was not at all effortless, that you, in just a few paragraphs, are giving us a sense of his personality, kind of a sort of sneak peek overview of the trajectory of his career. And you're also really setting him firmly in place. You know, we see these very concrete environments that he's operating in, his desk covered in flowers, you know, looking out the window of his neighborhood to watch the neighbor's cats, and then the life he dreams of a forest ranger, which I also found so relatable. That, it was powerful. So I think, to me, that's what I could have chosen many excerpts from this book, but I was really struck in this one that you do so much here in such a tight amount of space, but it also doesn't feel to the reader like an overwhelming amount of information. You know, it's really lovely. So I was sort of curious what it was like to try to pull all that together.
Thanks. Yeah, that's lovely to hear. I think it was a mix, of, it was also, the description I give of him, which is quite mean, really, I describe it, but it's all based on sort of people, firsthand sources sort of describing him, because so much has been written about him. So people who actually knew him, and then, describing, and often, so what always was at the forefront of these descriptions was the kind of contrast between his weird body and his weird physicality, but then his absolute poise and confidence when he was speaking, and the so I guess that's what's going on in the first paragraph. It's almost like I've condensed hundreds of pages of people describing him, and I've tried to take the things that I found the most striking and then try to convey, because it was so fascinating for me to see, because obviously there's no recordings of his lectures. There's only one very brief recording of his voice when he was very old, so it doesn't give me or anyone that, there's no way of knowing what it was actually like to listen to him speak. And yet there are so many of these really vivid descriptions of him where people are saying how weird he looked on the one hand, but also how incredible he was as a speaker and how entranced they were and the musicality of it all. So I really tried to bring that contrast, and because that's kind of part of the mystique of it all, of and he is odd and fascinating. So I was trying to, but I remember writing that and thinking, I'm not being very kind to Henri when I describe him as his very large forehead and his comparing him to an insect or a bird. But then you look at photos and you kind of think, well, and yeah, I think I was most fascinated when writing about him. I just find it so fascinating, the idea of someone becoming the most famous person in the world while not wanting to be famous, or while hating fame. And the noise of it, and hating noise in general, and hating the noise of modernity, whilst at the same time being seen and perceived as one of the most modern, interesting, exciting writers of the time. So I was also trying to play on that contrast as well, because I think it's, again, I've already said this, but it's what's at the heart of the book. So it was a way of laying it out. Actually, this is what the book is about. It's obviously about his ideas and his time and all the things that were happening around him, but at its core it's about the story of a man who was quite extraordinary, but who was also swept up in an extraordinary way, and who had a level of celebrity that was extremely rare, I think, at that time, the early 20th century. And who had the particularity of not liking fame, which I just find so interesting. So I think that's what I was trying to get across. But I remember sort of agonizing over those few paragraphs. So, which is why I was like, okay, well, hopefully it showed. And the fact that you chose them was, I was quite pleased.
Good, I'm glad. I do want to ask you a little bit about sources, because in this introduction, you talk about how there's a huge challenge in writing about Bergson, which is that so many of the sources you might have used were destroyed because he wanted them to be. How did you cope with that? Especially, it's such a compelling portrait of him. So how did you evoke that despite the lack of those sources?
Yeah, as you said, he asked his wife to destroy all of his papers. As a kind of a final act of self-preservation, I guess, and of control, because he knew that the vultures would come and try and he worried about his correspondence or his unpublished writings being misinterpreted after his death. So yeah, that isn't ideal when you're writing a biography. But the thing is, because he was so very famous, a lot actually did survive, because anyone who had anything with his name on just held on to it. So in terms of correspondence, we have a lot of his letters that have survived just because, people held on to them. So that's one thing. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of people who were sort of disciples, I guess, or in contact with him. They wrote extensively. Some of them kind of journaled every single meeting, and then those things were published. So it was still possible to, I guess, gain access to him, even though the things that were destroyed included apparently a manuscript he was working on, but he didn't want to publish. So I mean, that's obviously really sad for the researcher, but you kind of have to respect, I guess, well, you're kind of forced to respect his wishes because he enforced them so in such a radical way. So it was, it wasn't as much a challenge as you would think. But I think that's down to, his immense fame.
One thing that I really admired about this book is that your prose is just beautiful. And I confess to not being a person who regularly reads biographies of philosophers, but I was drawn to this one. I really loved it, including the explanations of complicated philosophical subjects. Was that, does that come naturally to you? Or please say no. Or did you have to revise a lot to get that sort of level of smooth writing?
Thanks. That's very, very kind of you to say. As I've already said, I revise so much, constantly revising. I'm never, to the last minute, I was rewriting or reorganizing sections. But the way in which I'm able to stop the revisions is that, so I compulsively revise and then I compulsively sort of reread passages. And the one thing that does come naturally to me is I think I get a sense of rhythm. Eventually something just feels right. So I don't know it until I've got it. But once I've got it, I read the passage and I think, okay, the rhythm of the passage is correct now. I don't have to revise it too much, even though I probably still will move one or two words around, but it gets less intense. But other than that, no, obviously it doesn't come naturally. It's a matter of painstaking. I'm never happy with what I've written in the first instance, and actually it usually takes several versions for me to feel okay with what I've written, and then even then, and also the way as I've said, also because the research and the writing were happening at the same time, there would be lots of passages where I would leave big blanks and say, okay, insert something about this here, and then by the time I got back to it, I actually ended up restructuring the whole passage because I found out. So the short answer is no, I'm extremely chaotic and extremely obsessive, I think, over the way, until it feels right, I can't really stop. But I think the danger of that is that you don't allow yourself to stop. You have to at some point trust that what you have to be able to somehow be in tune with what sounds good. For me, it's the sound. I have to sort of hear it in my head a little bit, and I think, okay, the rhythm is a bit abstract to say rhythm, but it is something to do with rhythm.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation that you had not realized how you would get really useful feedback from the editorial team that you worked with. What sorts of feedback did you find helpful from that part of the process?
Yeah, it was a weird process because I was completely on my own for, between signing the contract and then actually having people carefully look at what I'd written. It was only when I was nearing the end that they actually started looking. And the thing that was most helpful for me was them telling me, no, actually, this section doesn't quite, this section in itself is interesting, but it doesn't quite work in the context of the rest of the book. Those kinds of decisions, I think, are very hard to make on your own because you don't want to delete things when you've spent, when you've spent months and months researching and writing. And it is vital to have someone who can just look at it and say, either this needs to be shorter, or this just doesn't work in, this chapter or this section doesn't need to be here, really. So that was one thing. And then also there were actually points where they said, actually, you should probably develop this a bit more, give a bit more context, or, this is actually very interesting. All the things that you can't really see because you've spent too much time obsessing over it. So that was really, really helpful, and really, it's such a lonely process, and it was so nice to suddenly had two people who were independently kind of giving me all sorts of feedback. It's also very scary because you just start thinking, okay, what are they doing to my baby? But actually, I agreed with most of what they told me, and actually there were one or two things I didn't agree with, and there's one passage in one of the first chapters where I sort of go all the way back to pre-Socratic thinkers and one of the editors said, I think this really breaks the flow of the chapter. I don't think you should have this here. And I kind of ignored that, and they were okay with that. So there was a lot of room for, I took on board most of what they said, but that was one thing I didn't. But it was just nice to not be on my own anymore.
Sure.
Because I tended to be a bit nervous about sending things to people, even though I kind of forced myself to towards the end. I'd shown a lot of it to my partner, so he's read about 6 versions of the book, but it was more for moral support than for actual comments. But then I did end up sending a few chapters to get people's expertise as well, to make sure what I was saying sounded right and, that kind of thing as well. So more to do with the content rather than the structure or the writing itself. So I'd say that's important too.
In the last bit of our time, I want to talk about your own influences a little bit. So I'm wondering, are there other writers or books that you look to for inspiration in your own writing?
Yeah, it was interesting because when I started writing the book, my publisher recommended a few biographies I might read for inspiration. But then I quickly just found I couldn't do. I was finding it too. I was getting a sense of. I was finding it stressful to read other people's biographies, and I think it was because I felt that it was going to influence me too much. I was going to feel confined by other people's brilliant works, but just feel like, oh, there's one way of doing this, and I have to stick to it. So I ended up not reading the biography she'd recommended. And instead, aside from all the sources I was reading for the research, I actually remember one summer during the process, I was reading only Ishiguro novels, for instance. And I mean, the themes that he writes about are not too far from, he writes a lot about sort of memory but I just found that the way he's able to structure a narrative and structure a story, and also sort of gently guide the reader into that sense of nostalgia and memory. That's something that I found really inspiring. And I can't say that I applied it. I mean, I can't say to what extent that was applied in my own writing, because obviously it's a very different kind of exercise. I've never really written any fiction apart from when I was a kid and I plagiarized the writers I enjoyed. But I think there was something so that was really that had a big impact on me. I think reading Never Let Me Go and what's the one with the butler, The Remains of the Day, those books that are all about memory and nostalgia, and then bringing that into my writing, bringing the flow of the ideas. And I think just and so reading fiction, so I ended up just reading a lot of novels while I was writing the book. And I think there's something, because also I was trying to tell the story of tell a story, even though it's one that was sort of dictated by historical fact rather than my imagination. But that, you still want to draw your reader in. And I found that the novelists I admire, and I mentioned Ishiguro because I think it was his work I read the most over the course of writing. Yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer.
Oh, absolutely.
And there was another book that really, there's a book called Everybody by Olivia Laing. And it's kind of personal essay, but also history of science. And it's to do with bodies and sort of the history of how bodies are treated and obsessed over and portrayed. And she had such a cool way of, within a chapter, starting from a certain point, moving on to something completely different, but then somehow tying it back in. And I remember reading her book and thinking, oh, I can do that. Like, you're allowed to do that. I don't have to be super linear about everything, as long as I show the reader that they can trust me, and that, there's a starting point and there's an end point, and I'm gonna guide you from point A to point B, and we might go in all sorts of directions. So that was that, yeah. And I think if I had stuck to reading biographies, I wouldn't have had those epiphany moments of, oh, you're allowed, there's so many things you can do with a biography or with any sort of writing assignment.
What's the most influential writing advice you've ever received?
Right. So it's advice that I wish I applied more, but the few times I have done, it has really been great. And it's actually my uncle told me that so I can't remember where he got this from. He told me where he got it from. But the idea is simply that you just get the ideas on the page, edit later. And that's something I have to, that's something I have to remind myself, because sometimes you just get stuck on a first sentence because you want, or I do anyway, because you want that sentence to be great, or you want it to be exactly convey the idea you're trying to convey, when experience has shown me again and again that I'm going to completely change that sentence anyway later. So there's no point in trying to produce it fully formed and perfect, and actually just almost having a brainstorming session with your page on your own and getting everything down and then returning to model it. And I guess the idea being that you can't do any writing unless you start writing, and you will get stuck and you'll procrastinate and you'll get frustrated. So that's I think really helpful advice that I wish I was able to apply more. And I mean, I did mention earlier the sort of rigid nature of the French education system to do with, but I do think that was really helpful in a way, because so much of it was about making sure that you were getting your ideas across clearly. And one of the ways you did that was there's a similar structure to every essay that you're going to write when you're in the French education system, but every paragraph you write has to contain one idea. You can't have, you have to make sure that the person grading you will know what's happening in every part of the essay you're writing and be really clear about your own structure. And actually, in the 4-hour exams, we were meant to spend 1 hour just drafting the structure of the essay. And I think, as sort of rigid and confining as that can be, at the same time, it kind of taught me to have that critical reader in mind, but devote a lot of energy to clarity and making sure that I know where I'm going so that the reader will know where I'm going, kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Well, before I let you go, Herald of a Restless World, it's out now. It continues to get marvelous attention, which I'm so glad to see. Is there anything new that you're turning your attention to as you continue to promote your first book?
Well, I'm in the process of figuring out what the next step is going to be in terms. I would love to get to write another book, but I have no idea what that book will be yet. But I'm currently thinking about two essays which are very far removed from Burke's, and I don't know if you know the Apple TV show called Severance, but it's a really cool sci-fi show, and I'm going to try and write something about severance and philosophy. So I guess it's not so far removed from Bergson. And then I also really enjoy writing about music, so I'm hoping to do a bit more of that. So those are the things I'm thinking about, but I'm also thinking more big picture. Am I going to become, since this was my first book, are all my books going to be biographies of obscure French thinkers? Maybe. I would actually quite like to be that person who does that. But it could be I end up doing something completely different. So time will tell.
Fantastic. Well, we will be lucky to see, I think, whatever it is that you do next. Dr. Emily Herring, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past and talking about your writing process with me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely.
Thanks again to Emily for joining me, and to you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please tell someone about it or leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews encourage other people to check out the show. You can find links and transcripts at draftingthepast.com, and you can sign up for the free newsletter there for updates and more. In the meantime, remember that friends don't let friends write boring history.